This is a lesson about social practice art. And so I want to ask you, what is it that makes art or certain kinds of art become a social practice? Well, it would be anything with social interaction that is meant to be out in the public. Maybe it's something to be debated. It could be a collaboration with other people who may not even think of themselves as artists, but it's something that gets people's attention to get them involved. And so, in this lesson, I would like to also show you a few examples of artists that do this, but they are going to be using fiber arts or possibly fabric. A lot of times fiber arts uses weaving or recycled materials or yarn, or, I think you get the idea. Anything to do with materials and fabric. Um, One of my favorite African artists actually took aluminum cans, cut them into strips, and then wove those aluminum cans into giant tapestries. Not only was it recycled material, but it was also kind of a blanket kind of thing to relate universally with the world. Everybody uses blankets. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about blankets. The artist Marie Watt uh, was born in 1967 in Redmond, Washington. Her mother was of the Seneca tribe and the Turtle Clan, and she married a German father, or her father was German, Marie Watts, and they owned a ranch in Wyoming. She now lives in Oregon, but she likes to explore the meaning and the role of wool blankets in different cultures. So she experiments with the sculptural qualities of it. And she went and asked, people all over the nation to donate their wool blankets. Either they could be handmade or just a tradition in their family. Um, and she said the reason is because we are received in blankets, mainly when we were born, and we leave in blankets. Often people have been buried in history in blankets. And we live with blankets, don't we? We identify with blankets. Maybe you had a comfort blanket as a small kid and you hung on to that. And maybe you still have it. I don't know. Uh, but those blankets become a part of our lives, and we live with our blankets. And so she wanted to tell stories behind the blankets, and she would issue to anybody who willing to donate. She would issue a small tag you can see in the picture, where they would write a story or some kind of event around that blanket and the meaning to those people. They all contributed to her art, and then she built this totem pole, which is a Seneca tradition to do it out of wood, right? The clans were represented in totems, and in this case, the blankets were represented in her totem pole. And maybe you wonder, how did she make that? How did she get that to stand? It's pretty tall. I saw this in Denver at the Museum of Modern Art there, and it is quite tall. I mean, we're talking 20 feet tall. And I think she probably had to cut some holes in those blankets and then put a tall mount a tall pipe or something inside of that to keep it up. Really impactful to read some of those stories. But you can see she's done a number of things here with it to identify with other people. So let's talk about it. Um, we have our classroom challenge, or our classroom theme, which is create and connect. So we talked about maybe how she made it and how she collected things from other people into this totem pole. But you know, uh, to connect, she found other people, she found their stories, she found their culture, she used their symbols, she used her symbols, and then she could talk about life and family. All, together, by creating and then connecting, we find that this is a social practice art. I would like to talk next about another way to that's been implemented with social art, social practice. And it will begin with this number. So 8,484, this represents people. And you can say, well, is that a significant number? What's going on there? Well, a number of years ago, I was reading an article and found out that in the state of Utah, we had that year, this is in 2013, we had 8,484 adolescents locked up in juvenile detention. Now, if you know anything about juvenile detention, it's not always pretty. If somebody gets arrested between the age of 12 years old and 18 years old, they will take their clothing, they'll give them a jumpsuit, issue them some shoes and a toothbrush, and then they are put in a cell, a self-locking door with break. There is a window, and then a cement slab with a thin mat to sleep on. These kids could be there 45 days, or if they're in long term, they could be there a year or more. But they go to school during the day. They have guards who take them back and forth to meals and to classes, and then back to their cells. This is something of an issue because that year I was working with kids in rehabs and in detention, and they maybe weren't getting the help or needed help, and they don't always get the help. If they're locked up, they can see a psychologist, but in that year, this is how many kids were locked up. So I saw that as an issue. Utah had never had that many kids locked up before. And so I had to think of something. Can you think of anything right now that you could get 8,484 of to help to do some artwork with in a social practice way? What is it that I could get to represent these kids so that I could talk about their issues with the public? The kids were, their stories are confidential, or their names and details. And so I landed on these. Here are detention shoes. Now, there's no laces in those shoes because these kids couldn't have the laces. And this company was making them, the Bob Barker Company. Now, just as a side note, this guy here on the right, his name is Bob Barker, and he owned the company. He started it. He made a fortune as a game show host on this game show called The Price is Right. I doubt you've seen it, but he was a famous character. But he had outfitted jails and detention centers with jumpsuits and shoes and toothbrushes. And I knew I could try and approach these guys, this company, for their shoes. So I went to them and I said, hey, can I have 8,484 shoes? And their reply was, why? And I wanted them to donate. So I explained the reason, and they kind of liked it, but they said, we're going to have to get permission. So they went back, they got permission from Bob Barker, and they said, as long as you share the publicity and the news articles and the attention that you get from these shoes, then we'll give you the shoes. We'll discontinue these canvas shoes and we'll donate them to you. They sent them from around the nation to Ogden, Utah, where they have a big warehouse, and I went up and picked them up with a big box truck and brought them back. And I started immediately trying to get kids to paint these shoes, to paint their story on these shoes to represent their experience. Sometimes they had been neglected. Sometimes they had gotten into drugs and their parents didn't know, they were taken from their families, or they had committed a crime because of other mental health issues. So I want to talk about what those shoes look like and what I did with them. And here is the outcome. So I got a couple hundred that year to help paint those shoes, but that's a lot of shoes. If you think of each shoe as a person, that's a lot of kids in our state not getting maybe the attention that they needed. And so, and maybe you can identify the little pink dots around. Those are representative of the females in detention, and then the others, 80% were males, 20% were females. Um, but they did paint these, and they painted opposites. So I asked them, please show me some opposites in your life that you would like, that you could respond to. Now, some of these shoes had kids behind bars, and then maybe in some cases kids running away from their families, or maybe more abstract things like fire and water. But you can see here, this student was doing the opposites of Grumpy Smurf on the left and Smurfette on the right. Um, they this is opposites of male and female, obviously, but this kid was feeling grumpy. Um, he could relate to that, or the females in his life in different ways, I'm sure. But it wasn't always an explicit story behind it. It was just these are opposites in their life. Now, the Smurfs, that's kind of a copyright issue, but I was just trying to get them to talk to their therapists about it and to consider the issues that they were dealing with in their life. So let's look at another example. These are a little bit more universal in the way that what we ask ourselves, what's it like to walk in somebody else's shoes? And so for my eighth graders, you will be painting scenes from what it might be like to live like somebody else. Now you can see the bottom left corner, there's a Native American there, and then in the background there are wagons, probably pioneers coming into the territory where they live. And here represents a clash of cultures, or what it might have been like to try to live together. And so that's what my eighth graders are going to do. But my seventh graders, I would like you to deal with opposites. So here on the left, what do you think the opposite of the flames there would be on the other side of the shoe? Probably ice and water, right? Could that represent a personality? Sure, it could. This would represent you. So seventh graders are focusing on your own individual personality. Eighth graders are focusing on others. And maybe you need to use photo sources. So, but here's an example of two Star Wars droids that were good guys, right? And if you represent that in your life, everybody's experienced positive and negative things in their life. Maybe it's a battle with somebody in your life, even just emotionally. And so these could represent good, and the other side would be evil, where things aren't going the way that they should, maybe even ethically. And maybe so you put the bad guys as the droids behind Darth Vader, right? And that's the idea. But you do want to avoid copyright issues. If these are three-dimensional objects, you can copy them. But if they were illustrations, you wouldn't want to copy them. Another artist would have created them that way. Okay, so here are our objectives, but I want you to remember the skills you've learned in my class so far. You've learned things, the elements and principles of art. Use those. Use them to create contrast, texture, uh, maybe even the illusion of deep space, or um, perspective drawing in your shoe. And you've also learned color theory, and you've learned how to draw and shade. You can use any medium you like here that would stay on the shoe. So uh, colored pencils and graphite. We can seal it after you're done so it doesn't smudge and smear. It's meant to be an art object. So in this case, you wouldn't want to wear it around if you want to if you want to save that image and take care of it. So you can also paint it. If we paint it, we want to use gesso. If you haven't learned how to use gesso, we can talk about that. It's a primer that you put on canvases before you paint. And these shoes that we're going to use are canvas. And investigate the opposites if you're in seventh grade. of your personality and experiences, and then prepare the shoe. Maybe you stuff it with paper first so it holds its shape while you're painting and while you're doing the gesso, and the gesso will help it hold its shape too. If you're in eighth grade, discover another person, be empathetic about somebody you've never considered living the life they live, and then represent their life on your shoe. Paint or draw your image on that canvas or shoe using photo sources. And then when I grade you, I'm grading you on following the instructions, presenting your art responsibly, nothing inappropriate there. You also are being graded on the ethical standards of appropriation and copyright. And then you're connecting with other ideas outside of art. So immediately, as soon as you pick a subject, you're already talking about something outside of art. It's a social issue, even if it's nature, great. If it's dealing with sci-fi, that's fine. But they're things that represent you or somebody else.